We ended our preceding discussion with an analysis of some of the plot aspects of We the Living. Let us turn now to a consideration of Miss Rand's next novel, Anthem. In Anthem, the same ability to perceive issues in terms of essentials led Miss Rand to one of her most original and inspired literary philosophical ideas. The I is the root of all evil, the altruist collectivists declare. In Anthem's world of the future, the word I has disappeared from men's language. An individual man refers to himself as we and to another individual as they. And the reader is shown the nature of a world from which the concept of ego has vanished. In length, Anthem is closer to a novelette than to a novel. In style and form, it is closer to poetry than to prose. It is by far the most abstract of her works in its method of stylization. It is a projection of the issue of individualism versus collectivism, dramatized in its purest and starkest essence. In the world of Anthem, men are permitted no selfishness. Their thoughts, their occupations, their actions are dictated by the needs of their brothers. All the scientific and industrial achievements of the past unmentionable times have been lost. Men live by candlelight, bleed the sick to cure them of their ailments, and believe that the earth is flat and the sun revolves around it. Having destroyed the independent mind, this totally collectivized society has no power to keep that which only the independent mind can create and maintain. But out of this swamp, one man of rebellious and intransigent spirit arises, who is tortured and threatened with death for the crime of pursuing knowledge for his own pleasure and purpose. He had been ordered by the Council of Vocations to be a street sweeper as his life's occupation. Working alone at night and in secret, he has rediscovered the electric light. The rulers of his community order the light to be destroyed, and he is forced to escape with his discovery into an uncharted wilderness. One of the most beautiful scenes in the book, which is written in the form of his diary, occurs when the young girl whom he loves and who has followed him into the wilderness struggles to communicate her love for him without the use or knowledge of personal pronouns. Quote, "Today the golden one stopped suddenly and said, 'We love you.' But then they frowned and shook their head and looked at us helplessly. 'No,' they whispered, 'that is not what we wish to say.' They were silent. Then they spoke slowly, and their words were halting, like the words of a child learning to speak for the first time. 'We are one, alone, and only, and we love you who are one, alone, and only.' We looked into each other's eyes, and we knew that the breath of a miracle had touched us and fled, and left us groping vainly. And we felt torn for some word we could not find." Close quote. The hero's struggle to identify and name the concept of I is developed with such tension that when, after pages of we, one sees the opening line of the climactic chapter, the emotional experience is one of unsurpassable violence and power. I am, I think, I will. It is illuminating to note, in passing, a crucial difference between Ayn Rand's projection of a totally collectivized society and the projection of such a society in Orwell's 1984, written some years later. In 1984, what is presented is a super-industrialized, super-scientific civilization. Orwell and many authors who have since written similar books may believe that totalitarianism is immoral, but they do consider it practical. They share the premises of those they denounce, at least to this extent. They believe that it is possible to enslave man, to rule him by brute force, to forbid independent thought, and yet somehow to keep and continue all that which is the achievement of a free mind. Ayn Rand knew better, and years later in Atlas Shrugged, she showed fully what industrial civilization depends on and what happens when human intelligence ceases to function. One of the most impressive examples of Ayn Rand's power as a plot writer is the climax of the Fountainhead. To appreciate the ingenuity of the climax, consider the personal contexts of the leading characters and their relationships to one another. Consider the conflicts and problems which the plot has set up, and the manner in which the climax integrates and resolves all of them. The first note of the coming climax is sounded when Peter Keating asks Howard Roark to design the government housing project, Cortlandt Homes, and let him, Keating, take the credit. The project involves enormous architectural difficulties, and neither Keating nor any other architect has been able to solve them. Years later, Keating had graduated from architectural school with honors on the day when Roark was expelled. In school, Keating had often gone to Roark for help with his assignments. Later, when they were both in practice, Roark struggling desperately, Keating rising to the top of his profession, Keating had gone to Roark again and again for help with his work. Keating is the second-hander, the man without independent values or judgment, the man who lives through and by others, the borer who originates or creates nothing. Roark, the independent innovator, the egoist, the man who lives for his own sake and by his own mind, the man who refuses to compromise his convictions, has fought a battle of 18 years against the society around him. Now his architectural ideas are beginning to win. He is still denounced and opposed, but clients are coming to him in increasing numbers. Keating, having ridden for years on a prestige he had not earned, is now slipping. Another fashion is replacing him, and he is terrified. Roark agrees to design Cortlandt Homes for Keating on one condition, that it be built exactly as Roark designs it. It is Ellsworth Toohey, the architectural critic, who secures the government commission for Keating. Toohey, as a second-hander, moves solely by a lust for power. He preaches altruism and collectivism. He hates Roark and has been seeking to destroy him. He has worked to build up the careers of mediocrities like Keating in order to close the field to the Roarks. Now, after years of plotting and scheming, Toohey is at the height of his fame and influence. His specific goal at present is control of the Wynand newspaper chain, for which he works as a columnist. Gale Wynand is the great tragic figure in the Fountainhead. He has risen out of Hell's Kitchen by his own prodigious effort to the position of owner of a publishing empire. Having succumbed in his youth to the belief that virtue and integrity have no chance in human society, that life among men is inescapably evil, he concluded that one's only choice is to rule or be ruled, and chose to rule. He has poured his energy and genius into the creation of a vast newspaper chain that does not express his own values or convictions, but panders to the worst and lowest values and tastes of the mob. This, Wynand believes, is the path to power. With the exception of the Banner, his New York paper, Wynand has found only two passions in life: Dominic Francon, whom he marries, and Howard Roark, whom he first attempts to corrupt and whom he now virtually worships. Roark is that which Wineland had thought impossible, a man of integrity. But the realization toward which Wineland is moving is that if a Roark can be practical and can succeed on his own moral terms, then there is no justification for his, Wineland's, life. Wineland does not know that Dominique and Roark are in love with each other. Dominique had left Roark years earlier because she could not bear to witness the destruction to which she felt certain he was doomed. A passionate idealist, she, like Wineland, believes that the good has no chance among men. But she does not commit Wineland's treason. She does not seek any values from a world she despises. She married Wineland, whom she took as her symbol of the world's evil, in a deliberate act of intended self-destruction, seeking to kill her own ecstatic sense of life that made the world unbearable to her. Now she knows that her sense of life cannot be killed. She witnesses Keating's disintegration. She sees Roark winning his battle. She observes Wineland's helplessness before him, and she begins to understand the nature of her error, to grasp the impotence of evil. Such is the context at the time of the climax. When the first building of Cortlandt Homes is completed, Roark discovers that it has been totally disfigured. The bureaucrats have kept Roark's structural and engineering plans, without which the project would not have been possible. But, in defiance of their contract with Keating, which guaranteed that there would be no changes in the design, they have had the design of the building drastically altered. Keating has no legal recourse. The government bureau cannot be sued or forced to honor its contract. Roark dynamites Cortlandt. Then he waits at the scene of the explosion to be arrested. He will talk at the trial, he states. He has decided to make this a test case. There is a storm of public indignation against him, led by Ellsworth Toohey. Everyone is convinced that Roark is guilty. No one knows his motive, but they do not have to. Cortlandt is a housing project, a home for the poor. Roark has no right to a motive. Now observe what this climax accomplishes dramatically and philosophically. Roark's dynamiting of Cortlandt and the events to which this leads integrate the conflicts of the leading characters into a final focus of violent intensity, maximizing the philosophical values and issues at stake. The climax involves each of these characters intimately, and, in accordance with the logic of the basic course the characters have chosen, brings each of them to victory or defeat. Philosophically, the climax dramatizes the central theme of the book: individualism versus collectivism, the rights of the individual versus the claims of the collective. It dramatizes the role of the creator in human society and the manner in which the morality of altruism victimizes him. It dramatizes the fact that human survival is made possible by the men who think and produce, not by those who imitate and borrow, by the creators, not the second-handers, by the Roarks, not the Keatings. Peter Keating, who has attempted all his life to exist as a parasite off the minds of others, makes a final, desperate effort to save his entire career by such an act of parasitism, and is brought to disaster, to public disgrace, and to the full realization of his own emptiness and mediocrity. Gail Wineland attempts to defend Roark. He thinks that he will have his one great chance, to use the banner for the first time in his life for a cause in which he believes. This will vindicate his past and justify his pursuit of power. But the public rises in fury against Wineland for his defense of Roark. His readers desert him, and Wineland learns that it is not he who had directed public opinion, but public opinion that had controlled and directed him. He learns that a corrupt instrument, such as the banner, cannot be used to serve a noble purpose. To save the banner, he joins the voices denouncing Roark, but in the end, recognizing the futility of his career, recognizing that his pursuit of power has only delivered him into slavery, he closes the banner. He sees that a man cannot sacrifice his values all his life and expect to escape the consequences. That if Roark and Dominique were Winans' highest values, it is precisely they whom he would inevitably betray. You were a ruler of men, he tells himself. You held a leash. A leash is only a rope with a noose at both ends. With the closing of the banner, Toohey is left to start his struggle for power all over again. His years of scheming and plotting have brought him nothing. His fate dramatizes the fact that evil has the power to destroy, but not the power to create. That evil is blindness, emptiness, and impotence. Toohey, because of Winans' own errors, is able to destroy the banner, but he is not able to take it over. Prior to the Cortland explosion, Dominique had been coming to understand that she did not have to fear that her values were caught in a malevolent universe where they were doomed to destruction. The dynamiting of Cortland puts her to the severest test possible. Her highest value, Roark, is in far worse danger than any he had faced before. But she is not afraid for him. She knows that he is right, that he is one, that it is he who belongs on earth, no matter what happens, and thus she finds her way back to him. At the trial, Roark's statement to the jury is a summation of the philosophy which the events of the novel and of Roark's own life have illustrated. That all progress and achievement come from the independent mind. That altruism is the second-hander's weapon of exploitation, their device for enslaving the creator. That man is not a sacrificial animal, but has the right to exist for his own sake. That society depends on the work of the creators and has a right to that work only on the creator's terms. Roark is acquitted. His dynamiting of Cortland and his subsequent vindication are the final expression of his unyielding integrity and the confirmation of his conviction that the moral is the practical. Just as the events of the climax of the Fountainhead integrate and focus the conflicts and values of the various characters, so those events are themselves integrated with all the past events of the plot and grow logically out of them, like the final concluding statement of a long progression of syllogisms. When one reads Ayn Rand's novels in the order in which they were written, one is struck by the enormous artistic and philosophical growth from novel to novel. All the basic elements of her literary method are present from the beginning in We the Living, as are implicitly the basic elements of her philosophy. But each work is a richer and fuller expression of those elements, a more accomplished implementation, in a startlingly new and different form. Just as within each novel the climax sums up and dramatizes the meaning of all the preceding events, raised to the highest peak of emotional and intellectual intensity, so as a total work, Atlas Shrugged is the artistic and philosophical climax of all of Ayn Rand's novels, bringing the full of her dramatic, stylistic, and intellectual power to its most consummate expression. Ayn Rand has proudly referred to Atlas Shrugged as a stunt novel, proudly because she has made the word stunt applicable on so high a level. By the standard of sheer originality, the idea of a novel about the minds of the world going on strike is as magnificent a plot theme as any that could be conceived. Atlas Shrugged is a mystery story, quote, not about the murder of a man's body, but about the murder and rebirth of man's spirit, unquote. The reader is presented with a series of events that in the beginning appear incomprehensible. The world seems to be moving toward destruction in a manner no one can identify and for reasons no one can understand. A brilliant industrialist, Francisco d'Anconia, appears suddenly to have abandoned all purpose and to have become a worthless playboy. A great composer, Richard Halley, renounces his career after years of struggle on the night of his triumph. Businessmen who have been single-tracked in their devotion to their work, such as Midas Mulligan, Ellis Wyatt, and Ken Danaher, retire without explanation and disappear. A pirate, Ragnar Daneskjold, is loose on the high seas, attacking and robbing government relief ships. The world's most distinguished philosopher, Hugh Axton, leaves his university position and chooses to work as a cook in a diner. The abandoned remnant of a new type of motor that could have revolutionized industry is found on a scrap heap in the ruins of a factory. And in the growing darkness of a crumbling civilization, in moments of hopelessness, bewilderment, and despair, people are crying, "Who is John Galt?" without knowing exactly what the question means, or where it came from, or why they cry it. There are no red herrings in the story, no false clues. But the mystery to be solved is to be solved by philosophical detection, by identifying the philosophical implications of the evidence that is presented. The reader is not given arbitrary assertions to be taken on faith. He is given the facts and the evidence. His own mind is challenged to interpret that evidence. He is placed, in effect, in the position of the people in the novel, who observe the events around them, struggle to understand their cause and meaning, and are told the full truth only when they have seen sufficient evidence to form a reasoned judgment. The most impressive feature of Atlas Shrugged is its integration. The novel presents the essentials of an entire philosophical system: epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, politics, and psychology. It shows the interrelation of these subjects in business and a man's attitude toward his work, in love, in family relationships, in the press, in the universities, in economics, in art, in foreign relations, in science, in government, in sex. It presents a unified and comprehensive view of man and of man's relationship to existence. If one were to consider the ideas alone, apart from the novel in which they appear, the integration of so complex a philosophical system would be an extraordinarily impressive achievement. But when one considers that all of these philosophical issues are dramatized through a logically connected series of events involving a whole society, the feat of integration is breathtaking. The philosophical speeches in the novel are not arbitrarily superimposed on the plot, but are an integral and necessary part of it. They are essential to the dramatic action and to the story's final resolution. Tremendously complex in its structure, presenting the collapse of an entire society, the novel involves the live actions and goals of dozens of characters, from industrialists to bureaucrats to scientists to engineers to artists to intellectuals to farmers to labor leaders to the lowest worker in the underground tunnels of Taggart Transcontinental. Yet every character, action, and event has a dramatic and philosophical purpose. All are tied to the central situation, and all are integrated with one another. Nothing is superfluous, nothing is arbitrary, nothing is accidental. As the story moves forward, it projects, above all, the quality of the implacably, the irresistibly logical. John Galt, the man who has set in motion all the events of the story, does not appear until the last third of the novel, yet it is he who dominates the book. It is with the question, "Who is John Galt?" asked by some nameless bum that the novel opens. The question is a slang expression in prevalent use. By the context in which it appears, one gradually grasps its emotional meaning. It is a cry of despair and a plea for help. It reflects the ominousness that permeates the atmosphere, the sense of impending doom. No hero in fiction has received the build-up, or overture, that the author gives John Galt in the first two-thirds of Atlas Shrugged. But what is more remarkable still, the overture is justified. When John Galt does appear, he lives up to it. The climax of Atlas Shrugged is singularly typical of the spirit of the novel as a whole, the integration of the unexpected and the utterly logical, of that which starts by appearing shocking and ends by appearing self-evident. One reader has described Atlas Shrugged as having the quality of cosmic humor. It is written from the perspective of a mind that has discarded the conventional categories, standards, and frame of reference, and has looked at reality with a fresh glance. The nature of its climax was the first thing I learned about Atlas Shrugged when I met Ayn Rand in 1950, while she was writing the book. She had told me nothing about the story except that the hero was an inventor. "Can you tell me what is to be the climax?" I asked. She answered, "A scene in which the hero is being tortured by the villains." "Oh," I said, faintly disappointed at what seemed a rather standard device. "Do they want to force him to reveal the secret of some invention of his?" I asked. "No," she smiled. "They want to force him to become the dictator of the country." That, ladies and gentlemen, is the genius of the Ayn Rand imagination, literarily and philosophically. No other climax could sum up so eloquently the thesis and the meaning of Atlas Shrugged. The men of ability have all gone on strike. The world is in ruins, and the government officials make a last grotesque effort to preserve their system. They torture Galt to force him to join them and save their system somehow. They order him to think. They command him to take control. Naked force seeking to compel a mind to function. And then the ultimate absurdity of their position is thrown in the torturers' faces. They are using an electric machine to torture Galt, and its generator breaks down. The brute who is operating the machine does not know how to repair it. Neither do the officials. Galt lifts his head and contemptuously tells them how to repair it, in a masterstroke of psychological warfare. The brute runs away in horror at the realization that they need Galt's help even to torture him. The officials flee the cellar also, quote, "the cellar where the living generator was left tied by the side of the dead one," unquote. Ayn Rand's novels cannot be read as most other novels are read. They cannot be skipped, skimmed, or read approximately. To attempt to do so is to fail to read them at all. Many of Miss Rand's readers have noted this fact. She has often received letters from admirers who tell her that they had begun to read one of her novels in the casual and cursory manner which they usually found quite adequate for fiction, but then after a short while stopped and saw that they had begun reading her book again from the beginning, because they realized that in every line she is saying something, and their customary method of reading caused them to miss too much. Her novels are written with the purposefulness and precision of a mind that functions in full intellectual focus, and demands the same of the reader. Atlas Shrugged is nearly 700,000 words long, and there is not one superfluous paragraph. When one considers the scope of what it covers, its economy is one of its most remarkable features. The reader who would assert that the book is too long or repetitious imagines, because he perceives things only in the most crudely primitive and generalized manner, that he has understood the book instantly. In fact, he has scarcely understood it at all. Let us turn now to a consideration of the stylistic aspects of Miss Rand's work. If one studies the descriptive passages in Ayn Rand's novels, one will observe how frequently they serve several different purposes simultaneously, aside from the recreating of the physical setting. For instance, in the opening pages of Atlas Shrugged, the reader must be introduced to a New York City that is disturbingly unlike the New York City of the present. A mood of ominousness must be established. The scene must be set for the presentation of a disintegrating society. Now, observe what is communicated, and by what means it is communicated, in the description of the buildings of the city on the second page of the first chapter. Quote, "The clouds and the shafts of skyscrapers against them were turning brown, like an old painting in oil, the color of a fading masterpiece. Long streaks of grime ran from under the pinnacles down the slender, soot-eaten walls. High on the side of a tower there was a crack in the shape of a motionless lightning, the length of 10 stories. A jagged object cut the sky above the roofs. It was half a spire, still holding the glow of the sunset. The gold leaf had long since peeled off the other half. The glow was red and still, like the reflection of a fire. Not an active fire, but a dying one, which it is too late to stop." Close quote. In reading such a passage, one may not be fully aware of how it is happening, but in answer to such lines as, "like an old painting in oil, the color of a fading masterpiece," or "not an active fire, but a dying one, which it is too late to stop," one's emotions will be responding. One will find oneself slowly being carried into the atmosphere of a collapsing civilization, because every line of description, every adjective and metaphor has been calculated to produce the exact effect the author intends. There are persons to whom clarity and precision are the enemies of poetry and emotion. They equate the artistic with the fuzzy, the vague, and the diffuse. Seeking in art the reflection and confirmation of their sense of life, they are psychologically and aesthetically at home only with the blurred and the indeterminate. That which is sharply in focus clashes with their own mental state. In such persons, Ayn Rand's literary style will invoke a feeling of disquietude and resentment. Ayn Rand's use of language is best characterized by a line concerning Dagny Taggart, quote, "She had regarded language as a tool of honor, always to be used as if one were under oath, an oath of allegiance to reality and to respect for human beings," unquote. Because her writing is lucid, such persons will tell themselves that it is crude. Because her writing conveys an unequivocal meaning and does not suggest a mobile to be interpreted by the subjective whim of any reader, they will tell themselves that it lacks poetry. Because her writing demands that they be conscious when they read it, they will tell themselves that it is not art. But the specific trademark of her literary style is its power vividly to recreate sensory reality and inner psychological states, to induce the most intense emotions, and to accomplish this by means of the most calculated selection of words, images, and events, giving to logic a poetry it had never had before, and to poetry a logic it had never had before. Consider the sequence in Atlas Shrugged that describes the first train ride on the new line Dagny Taggart has built in Colorado. The literary assignment in this sequence is extremely complex. To convey the sensory reality of motion in a speeding train, as experienced by Dagny and Reardon, who are riding in the cab of the engine, to convey the exaltation of a great achievement, the creation of this railroad line against overwhelming obstacles, to illustrate the philosophical meaning of that achievement, to project that sense of life which is peculiarly Dagny's and Reardon's, and to show the start of their love affair as the inexorable climax toward which the triumphant sweep of that train ride carries them. A writer who is familiar with the technical problems involved in communicating the sensation of motion and in projecting complex emotional states can read this sequence only with awe. The sense of motion is caught from the opening paragraph. Quote, "The green-blue rails ran to meet them like two jets shot out of a single point beyond the curve of the earth. The cross-ties melted as they approached into a smooth stream rolling down under the wheels. A blurred streak clung to the side of the engine low over the ground. Trees and telegraph poles sprang into sight abruptly and went by as if jerked back. The green plain stretched past in a leisurely flow. At the edge of the sky, a long wave of mountains reversed the movement and seemed to follow the train." Unquote. Then, several paragraphs later, quote, "Things streaked past. A water tank, a tree, a shanty, a grain silo. They had a windshield wiper motion. They were rising, describing a curve and dropping back. The telegraph wires ran a race with the train, rising and falling from pole to pole in an even rhythm, like the cardiograph record of a steady heartbeat written across the sky. The glass sheets of the cab's windows made the spread of the field seem vaster. The earth looked as open to movement as it was to sight. Yet nothing was distant and nothing was out of reach. She had barely grasped the sparkle of a lake ahead, and in the next instant she was beside it, then past." Unquote. Observe in the following paragraph, as the train enters and then passes through a city, in what manner the reader is given the essentials of the sensory perceptions experienced by Dagny and Reardon. Quote, "It was a succession of minutes, but it hit them as a single whole. First they saw the lone shapes, which were factories, rolling across their window panes. Then the shapes fused into the blur of streets. Then a delta of rail spread out before them, like the mouth of a funnel, sucking them into the Taggart station, with nothing to protect them but the small green beads of light scattered over the ground. From the height of the cab they saw boxcars on sidings streak past as flat ribbons of rooftops. The black hole of the train shed flew at their faces. They hurtled through an explosion of sound, the beating of wheels against the glass panes of a vault, and the screams of cheering from a mass that swayed like a liquid in the darkness among steel columns. They flew toward a glowing arch and the green lights hanging in the open sky beyond, the green lights that were like the doorknobs of space, throwing door after door open before them. Then, vanishing behind them, went the streets clotted with traffic, the open windows bulging with human figures, the screaming sirens, and, from the top of a distant skyscraper, a cloud of paper snowflakes shimmering on the air, flung by someone who saw the passage of a silver bullet across a city stopped still to watch it." Close quote. Then still later, when Dagny leaves the cab to look at the motors, quote, "She moves slowly along the length of the motor units, down a narrow passage between the engines and the wall. She felt the immodesty of an intruder, as if she had slipped inside a living creature, under its silver skin, and were watching its life beating in gray metal cylinders, in twisted coils, in sealed tubes, in the convulsive whirl of blades in wire cages. The enormous complexity of the shape above her was drained by invisible channels, and the violence raging within it was led to fragile needles on glass dials, to green and red beads winking on panels, to tall thin cabinets stenciled high voltage. Why had she always felt that joyous sense of confidence when looking at machines, she thought. In these giant shapes, two aspects pertaining to the inhuman were radiantly absent, the causeless and the purposeless. Every part of the motors was an embodied answer to why and what for, like the steps of a life course chosen by the sort of mind she worshipped. The motors were a moral code cast in steel. Unquote. Then, later, quote, she was making her way back toward the cab, feeling that she wanted to laugh, to kneel or lift her arms, wishing she were able to release the thing she felt, knowing that it had no form of expression. She stopped. She saw Reardon standing by the steps of the door to the cab. He was looking at her as if he knew why she had escaped and what she felt. They stood still, their bodies becoming a glance that met across a narrow passage. The beating within her was one with the beating of the motors, and she felt as if both came from him. The pounding rhythm wiped out her will. They went back to the cab silently, knowing that there had been a moment which was not to be mentioned between them. Unquote. Pages later, when they stand on a balcony that night, after the train ride had ended, its mood and meaning are picked up and continued as the emotional lead into their love affair. Quote, she felt a rhythm without sound or movement, a sense of beating tension as if the wheels of the John Galt line were still speeding on. Slowly, in answer and in resistance to an unspoken summons, she turned and looked at him. Unquote. Now consider, finally, the last two paragraphs of the sequence, and ask yourself whether you are reading the description of a sex act or the treatise on the metaphysical relation of mind and body, or a statement of the moral purpose of man's life, or all three. Quote, he stood looking down at her naked body. He leaned over. She heard his voice. It was more a statement of contemptuous triumph than a question. You want it? Her answer was more a gasp than a word, her eyes closed, her mouth open. Yes. She knew that what she felt with the skin of her arms was the cloth of his shirt. She knew that the lips she felt on her mouth were his, but in the rest of her there was no distinction between his being and her own, as there was no division between body and spirit. Through all the steps of the years behind them, the steps down a course chosen in the courage of a single loyalty, their love of existence, chosen in the knowledge that nothing will be given, that one must make one's own desire and every shape of its fulfillment. Through the steps of shaping metal rails and motors, they had moved by the power of the thought that one remakes the earth for one's enjoyment, that man's spirit gives meaning to insentient matter by molding it to serve one's chosen goal. The course led them to the moment when, in answer to the highest of one's values, in an admiration not to be expressed by any other form of tribute, one's spirit makes one's body become the tribute, recasting it, as proof, as sanction, as reward, into a single sensation of such intensity of joy that no other sanction of one's existence is necessary. He heard the moan of her breath. She felt the shudder of his body in the same instant. Unquote. In Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand has created more than a great novel. By any rational, objective literary standard, from the standpoint of plot structure, suspense, drama, imaginativeness, characterization, evocative and communicative use of language, originality, scope of theme and subject, psychological profundity and philosophical richness, Atlas Shrugged is the climax of the novel form, carrying that form to unprecedented heights of intellectual and artistic power. Atlas Shrugged has inspired the most passionate admiration and the most violent antagonism. Neither response is difficult to understand if one considers everything which, literarily and philosophically, the novel represents and challenges. Contrast the nature of the story in Atlas Shrugged with the stories currently hailed as great literature, concerning sensitive homosexuals in search of personal identity, smiling old ladies with irresistible compulsions to strangle birds and cats, mothers engaged in incestuous relationships with their sons, dope addicts who find spiritual fulfillment in Zen Buddhism, undistinguished mediocrities whose claim to importance is the adulteries or murders they suddenly commit for no reason known to anyone, least of all to their authors. Contrast the sense of life and the view of man projected in Atlas Shrugged with that projected by all the fashionable voices now wailing that life is sordid and futile, that human nature is a sewer, that man's mind is impotent, that man is metaphysically helpless, that terror is man's natural state. And then remember that every aesthetic response is a psychological confession. In an age when one of the most demanding aspects of writing a novel, the construction of a plot, is solved by the declaration that plot is vulgar and artificial, when pretentious little stories about nothing whatever are hailed as the expression of a superior sophistication because they are about nothing whatever, when ponderous, unwieldy sentences are taken not as evidence of an author's ineptitude, but as proof of his sincerity, when unintelligibility is viewed as the hallmark of profundity, when the projection of any emotional mood except boredom or hysteria is regarded as unreal, when purposefulness, clarity, or any other manifestation of intellect is treated as an artistic liability, when, in a word, literature is dominated by the worship of unconsciousness, it is not startling that the supporters of such a trend should be disinclined to understand or identify the nature of Ayn Rand's artistic achievement. If they apprehend in Atlas Shrugged the presence of that which is irrevocably inimical to their view of life and of art, if they sense that to acknowledge Atlas Shrugged as great literature is to set a standard devastating and terrifying in its implications for their own products and values, if they feel that it is Atlas Shrugged or them, can one say that they are mistaken? Just as in philosophy Ayn Rand has challenged the modern doctrines of neo-mysticism and epistemological agnosticism, so in literature she has challenged the view of man as an impotent zombie without intellect, efficacy, or self-esteem. Just as she has opposed the fashionable philosophical dogmas of fatalism, determinism, and man's metaphysical passivity, so she has opposed the fashionable literary projections of man as a stuporous puppet, manipulated by instinct and socio-economic status. Just as she has rejected the mystic theories of original sin, of man's depravity and the misery of life on earth, so she has rejected the presentations of unfocused, whim-worshipping neurotics, staggering along a trail of hysterical destruction to the abyss of whimpering defeat. Just as she has rescued philosophy from the cult of the anti-mind and the anti-man, so she has rescued literature from the cult of the anti-novel and the anti-hero. As an artist, she has brought men a new sense of life. As a philosopher, she has brought them the intellectual implementation of that sense of life. She has shown what it depends on and how it is to be earned. When one considers the quality of enraptured idealism that dominates her work, and the affirmative view of the human potential that she projects, the most morally corrupt of the attacks leveled against her, and the most psychologically revealing, is the assertion that she is motivated, quote, by a hatred of humanity, unquote. It is culturally significant that writers who present dope addicts and psychopaths as their image of human nature are not accused of hatred for humanity, but a writer who presents men of integrity and genius as her image of human nature is. In Ayn Rand's novels, the heroes, the men of outstanding moral character and intellectual ability, are exalted. The men of conscientious honesty and average ability are treated with respect and sympathy. A far more profound respect and sympathy, it is worth adding, than they have ever been accorded in any so-called humanitarian novel. There is only one class of men who receive moral condemnation: the men who demand any form of the unearned, in matter or in spirit, who propose to treat other men as sacrificial animals, who claim the right to rule others by physical force. Is it her implacable sense of justice, her loyalty to those who are not evil, her concern for the morally innocent and her contempt for the morally guilty, that makes Ayn Rand a hater of humanity? If those who charge Ayn Rand with hatred, feeling themselves to be its object, choose to identify and classify themselves with the men she condemns, doubtless they know best. But then it is not Ayn Rand or humanity whom they have damned. In presenting the struggle of an innovator against the society of his time, in the Fountainhead, Ayn Rand wrote many passages that were to prove prophetic of her own future. One such passage, especially relevant here, occurs at a trial where Howard Roark is being sued by a client who had commissioned him to build a temple of the human spirit, and who subsequently claimed that Roark's temple was sacrilegious. The following is from Dominic Francon's testimony at that trial. Quote, Howard Roark built a temple to the human spirit. He saw man as strong, proud, clean, wise, and fearless. He saw man as a heroic being, and he built a temple to that. A temple is a place where man is to experience exaltation. He thought that exaltation comes from the consciousness of being guiltless, of seeing the truth and achieving it, of living up to one's highest possibility, of knowing no shame and having no cause for shame, of being able to stand naked in full sunlight. He thought that exaltation means joy, and that joy is man's birthright. He thought that a place built as a setting for man is a sacred place. That is what Howard Roark thought of man and of exaltation. But Ellsworth Toohey said that this temple was a monument to a profound hatred of humanity. Ellsworth Toohey said that the essence of exaltation was to be scared out of your wits, to fall down and to grovel. Ellsworth Toohey said that man's highest act was to realize his own worthlessness and to beg forgiveness. Ellsworth Toohey is a lover of mankind. The Stoddard Temple is a threat to many things. If it were allowed to exist, nobody would dare to look at himself in the mirror. And that is a cruel thing to ask of men. Ask anything of men. Ask them to achieve wealth, fame, love, brutality, murder, self-sacrifice. But don't ask them to achieve self-respect. They will hate your soul. They won't say, of course, that they hate you. They will say that you hate them. It's near enough, I suppose. They know the emotion involved. Unquote. I think the applicability of this passage to the criticisms of Atlas Shrugged should be obvious. The most tragic victims of the man-degrading nature of contemporary literature are the young. They have watched the progression from the boredom of conventional naturalism to the horror of nightmare symbolism, the progression from stories about the folks next door to stories about the dipsomaniac next door, the crippled dwarf next door, the axe murderer next door, the psychotic next door. This, they are now informed, is what life is really like. In projecting the artist's view of man's metaphysical relationship to existence, art explicitly or implicitly holds up to man the value goals of life. It shows him what is possible and what is worth striving for. It can tell him that he is doomed and that nothing is worth striving for, or it can show him the life of a Howard Roark or a John Galt. It is particularly when one is young, when one is still forming one's soul, that one desperately needs, as example, as inspiration, as fuel, as antidote to the sight of the world around one, the vision of life as it might be and ought to be, the vision of heroes fighting for values worth achieving in a universe where achievement is possible. It is not descriptions of the people next door that a young person requires, but an escape from the people next door to a wider view of the human potentiality. This is what the young have found in the novels of Ayn Rand, and that is the key to the enormous popularity of her novels. Speaking before a group of university students, Ayn Rand has stated, quote, "Art is an expression of one's sense of life. Where in today's culture do we find any remnant of the joyous, the benevolent, the confident, the beautiful, the exciting? Why are the higher reaches of artistic skill devoted exclusively to the colors of festering wounds and the sounds of cosmic wailing? In the field of aesthetics, those of you who are sick of the neo-savages of non-objective art should rebel against their dogma that the garbage can is a symbol of man's soul. Take them at their word. Grant them their right to reveal their souls in the appropriate form they have chosen. But do not grant them the right to speak for your soul, nor for the soul of man, nor for his sense of life. In the face of their maudlin whining that they have given up, flaunt the fact that you have not. To the motto, 'We who are not about to die,' add, 'We who are not impotent, we who are not hopeless, we who are not depraved, we whose lives are not banal, nor gritty, nor irrational.' The correction of a disaster has to begin with the correction of its cause. It is philosophy that has brought us to this state. It is only philosophy that can lead us out. Not the philosophy of the neo-mystics which has run its course, but the rebirth of a philosophy of reason. That is, a reassertion of man's self-esteem with its three consequences: a rational morality, a rational aesthetics, and a romantic renaissance in art." Close quote. In her own novels, that renaissance has found the greatest and most inspiring of beginnings. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.